Okay, let's begin. So, welcome to this webinar, Fascinating and Inspiring You. Obviously, I'm David Lee. So, just to give you some quick background on this, what sparked my interest in putting this together was listening to a program by a marketing expert named Dan Kennedy talking about Sally Hogshead's work, author of Fascinate. You see this quote from her: "Messages that fail to fascinate will become irrelevant. It's that simple." And he was talking about how important it is in a world of cluttered messages to be able to have a message that's fascinating, or else people just won't listen to you. And that obviously got me thinking about the world of presenting ideas in meetings, one-on-one, and in large group presentations, and how important it is to make it fascinating. And so how do you have that sort of riveted attention like said cat has in this picture? And so that's what we're going to talk about, is how to use stories, primarily stories, even though analogies are also a great way to make your ideas more fascinating and interesting. So here's a great quote by Maya Angelou, and I'm audio recording this too, so I'll just read this for the audio folks. "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And that's one of the big goals of any communication that you have, to be able to elicit some type of emotional response, so people just don't hear what you have to say in sort of a like, yeah, all right, whatever mode. And that's where storytelling really shines. So we're hopefully moving forward here. Next, there we go. So one of the big goals with this work is, how do you improve the 3 I's? How do you make your message more intriguing, more influential, and more inspiring? So people want to hear what you have to say. The message that you have, whether it's be more respectful in the workplace, use more safe procedures, or what I have to offer is really useful to you even though I'm in a different field. These are all some of the issues that people who responded to my request for what do you want to be more influential in. Thank you for those of you who did that. These are some of the requests that people have. So that whatever your message is more influential, more persuasive, and also more inspiring. How do you bring out the best in people, inspire them to take action? And then we're going to add the 2 F's, fascinating and fun. And so rather than being one of those death by PowerPoint presenters, that you spice up your presentation with stories. One of the things, though, that's sort of ironic as I was putting this together is that actually in webinars, I tend to do less storytelling than I do live, just because of the format. So I will obviously have some stories, but not as much as I typically do, which, again, I think is a little ironic. So we're going to talk about what makes you fascinating, a few quick tips to get you started, and then how to so-called storyify your presentation, storyify your message. And so hopefully you got my email on with the handouts, and if you didn't, it'll be there when you come back. It's not necessary for the webinar. Those of you who've been on other webinars of mine, most of the time I don't have a handout, but I decided to get with a program and give you a handout. But there's the first part of it in the handouts, questions: what makes you fascinating and what fascinates you? We're going to talk about that in a moment. So one of the things I think oftentimes people get stuck when it comes to, like, where do I find stories? You know, where are they? A lot of your best stories will come from your own life. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that people don't realize how fascinating they are, because it's, you know, it's just your life. And I'll give you a quick example. One of the things that I've been doing lately so here's the story. In starting off programs and doing team building, I'll ask people to answer the question, what's something that nobody knows about you that's kind of cool, and what's sort of a fun interest of yours that's pretty unusual? And it's really fascinating and eye-opening, some of the amazing experiences and also really sort of esoteric interests that people have. And it's just, not only is it a great little team building exercise, but it's really a wonderful way for people to tap into. You're a lot more fascinating than you think. And in the exercise, like your coworkers are a lot more fascinating than you think. So you become more fascinating by tapping into what makes you fascinated. And I'm working on another handout that you can have after the webinar that gives you more questions to guide you in that process. But also thinking about what fascinates you. And oftentimes some of those unique interests of ours and the things that draw our attention are some of the best sources of stories. Okay, so let's do a couple quick tips for being a more fascinating, inspiring storyteller before we launch into the system. So where do you find stories? Your life, as I mentioned before, and the handout that you'll be getting will help you. Other people's lives. So some of the coolest stories that I have come from friends. And part of being a more fascinating communicator is actually being more fascinated in other people and amping up your curiosity level when people share stories about things that they're into, vacations that they've had, interesting conversations that they've had that left you thinking, wow, I never would have said that to that person, or fascinating perspective that somebody had on a challenge. And you find yourself thinking, oh, I never would have thought it that way. That's the foundation of a really cool story. And just a quick FYI, and again, those of you who've listened to other storytelling programs by me, this will sound familiar, and hopefully you're doing it. Jot down some notes after you've had the conversation or the interesting experience, because otherwise you're going to forget. And I'll say a little more about that in a minute. Is there interesting things that you hear or read about? So, for instance, this is sad, obviously. Rare bunny crushed to death by cameraman at the German zoo. And so this guy was videoing a press, not a press release, but a press, speak to the press session that the zoo was having. And the guy was like so into what he was doing, he backed up and he stepped on the poor little bunny. Now, one of the things that I always do whenever anything catches my attention, whether I'm surprised or I'm like, ouch, like this, I find myself thinking, that's interesting. What could this be a metaphor for? How could I use this to dramatize a teaching point? And so, for instance, one of the issues, and one of the folks on the webinar, one of the areas that they wanted to apply this to was doing training around cultivating a more respectful workplace and harassment training. Well, one of the things that came up in my mind when I thought about what is this a metaphor for is that oftentimes we're oblivious to how we crush other people's spirits or we stomp on their feelings because we're so into whatever it is that we're into. And I also use this when I'm doing personality styles training, because if any of you know the DISC profile, the high Ds, the drivers, or the dominant personality styles, these are people with really strong personalities. Oftentimes they crush people without even knowing it. They're not trying to be mean, but just they're so powerful in saying their point of view or disagreeing. So I share this as an example of coming across something in the news or in other people's blogs that make you think, wow, that's interesting, that's fascinating, and then asking, how could I use this to dramatize a teaching point? Scenes from movies. This is a scene from Lord of the Rings that I use in a program for leaders on how to help access the inner hero of your people. And this scene is Frodo is the Hobbit there, and he's talking to Gandalf. All you see is Gandalf's kind of scruffy hair there. He's talking to Gandalf about how he wishes this had never happened. So, here's this humble little hobbit, and now it's on his shoulders to save the world, and he has the Ring of Power, and it's up to him to bring it to the Lake of Fire in Mordor, throw it in there, and therefore save the world from evil and darkness. And he said, and so when I'm working with leaders, I will play this. It's like a 30-minute clip. And Frodo says to Gandalf, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened. And maybe you can relate not as a leader, but as somebody who's dealing, talking with a friend who's going through a really rough time, and they're bemoaning their circumstances. And Gandalf says to Frodo, he says, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to choose. All we have to choose is the time that is given to us. That is not for them to choose. All we have to choose is what to do with the time that is given to us. And so I use that little clip to dramatize how Gandalf both acknowledges Frodo's distress. He doesn't just say, hey, buck up, buddy, man up here, or hobbit up. He acknowledges his distress. So do all who live to see such times. Now, I also say, if this were a coaching session, I would encourage Gandalf to do a little more empathizing before he launches into his perspective shift. But then he challenges Frodo to look at what's going on from a bigger perspective and look at what's in his circle of control. So that's an example of using a scene from a movie where I could just talk with a group about it, or I could play that video clip. And there are lots of really cool scenes from movies you can use. Using fascinating research. And those of you who know my work know that I love to use scientific research and translate it into, well, what does that mean for the workplace? And actually, if you go to storiesthatchange.com and in the search function, if you put in research, you'll hear some clips from programs I've given that use some of what I find some of the most fascinating research and then translate it. So how do you find stories? That's John Keats, the famous poet, by the way, on the right. Practice attentiveness. And I've got Keats there because he said something about poetry, which is how I feel about storytelling. He said, poetry makes everything interesting. And that's one of the real gifts of immersing yourself in storytelling, is because you begin to notice the rich possibility and wisdom that can be extracted from seemingly simple everyday experiences. And I'll share an example in a moment. So practice paying attention to simple everyday experiences. It doesn't have to be the time you climbed K2 or fought off a grizzly bear with a sock for it to be a compelling story. I think some of the most compelling stories are those that come from simple everyday life because everybody can relate to them. But what you add to it, and this is where the fascination factor comes to it, you add to it your unique spin, your unique awareness. So cultivating curiosity and asking, how could I use this as a teaching story? And asking, what might this be a metaphor for? Let me give you an example. I love this. I had emailed a buddy of mine, a client and buddy, who I hadn't talked with for a long time. And in previous conversations, we had talked about our different areas of fitness, what we're into. And so I'd asked him in sort of the catch-up email, and this is what he emailed back. Yes, I try to stay fit with barefoot weights, running, and cycling. Now, I'm hugely all about barefoot working out because it's made a huge difference in both my foot integrity and my knee pain. Knee pain gone, foot integrity, don't need to use orthotics. This is not a fitness webinar, but I just wanted to put some context around why I was like, oh, this is so cool. I want to hear more about this. So I emailed Jeff back, tell me more. And what he emailed me back was so fascinating because he said, the barefoot was not supposed to be there. What happened was when I texted my sister that I was coming over for dinner, I texted her that I would come with, W/Barefoot Wine, that brand Barefoot Wine. And now his cell phone, wanting to save him the effort, autofills. Now when he puts with, autofills with Barefoot. He didn't even notice that. And so I found myself thinking, what's this a metaphor? This is interesting. So stepping back, bringing that sense of curiosity and attentiveness to common everyday experiences. And what it ends up motivating me to do is to write an article that was published on this customer service site. Are you autofilling instead of listening? And I thought, what a perfect metaphor for oftentimes, whether it's in customer service, the person thinks that they've heard it so many times before, and so they just internally autofill what the person is saying as opposed to truly listening to what they're saying. Think about in personal relationships, how oftentimes people do that. In fact, I was just meeting with somebody this week who said how she had shared this article with her husband and confessed to having just autofilled with him. So that's an example of just taking an everyday life experience and turning it into a teaching story that makes the point impact at a deeper level because it's more fascinating and interesting because it's embedded in a story. So other questions people asked: when do you tell stories? What about people who are impatient or there's no time for a story? What cues do you look for? Like, oh, now's a good time to tell a story. When do you just go for a straightforward approach? I'll be answering those later on the blog because of the time that we have, but because you asked them, I will answer them. So how do you storyify your presentation? So how do you take, and when I say presentation, put it in air quotes. It could be a big presentation at a big event. It could be sharing your idea at a team meeting, at a company-wide meeting. It could be a one-on-one coaching session or a sales session. How do you add stories to make it more fascinating and inspiring? So we're going to talk about 4 of these 6 steps. Assess your audience, clarify your intent, identify your points, find appropriate stories and analogies, test and refine. And so the test and refine means test out your story on a couple of different people and find out, what's your takeaway? Did the point I was trying to make, did I make it? Did I put too much detail in? Was there not enough detail? Could you make a picture in your mind? And actually related to testing and refining, on my website, if you search, if you put in pet colors, there's a video of somebody that I took a video of their sales pitch, if you will, at a conference I was at. And then I talked about some coaching suggestions about how to make her elevator speech, if you will, more compelling. Okay, so we're going to do steps 1 through 4. So you notice what we have here is a system that helps you translate your message into stories, and it also helps you create more intentionality and precision with your stories. I just did a coaching group with a group of coaches on how to use stories to make their messages more compelling. And one of the members said how even though she's been using stories for years, she realizes that she's not really intentional about it. She just sort of whips out stories left and right. And the more intentional you are, the more power your stories have because they're actually achieving your purpose, not simply being interesting. So here we go. This is where your handouts will come into play. If you don't have your handouts, not to worry. And I'll also send you the slides. I'll put it on the follow-up page so you don't have to furiously write out the slides. Just use the slides as a trigger for your notes, okay? And actually, feel free to ask any questions as we go along. Actually, I'm going to ask you a question just real quickly. This is the Goldilocks question. If you could just quickly type in if it's too fast, too slow, or just right. Because, well, I want it to be the right pace for you. So if you can just go ahead and do that, I just want to quickly get a sense. Too fast, too slow, just right. Just right. Good, 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 good. Just right. Okay. Any other responses? We've got some shy people. Well, the just rights win. Okay, thank you. Thanks for weighing in. And also, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to type them in. Okay, so number one, you need to assess your audience because where they are influences your intention and your story and analogy choices. So let's get back to the slide here, forward. So how aware are they of the issue? So for instance, one of the scenarios that a participant asked was getting people to do health screening. Well, are they aware of the benefits of health screening? Are they aware of the cost, is management aware of the cost savings, et cetera? What about supervisory training? Are they aware of the incredible impact they, maybe as a frontline supervisor, have on employee motivation, engagement, et cetera? So if your audience already gets it, big problem, big issue, we care about this, then you don't have to do lots of stories to heighten awareness. That's not an appropriate use of your stories. But if it's an audience who's clueless about the issue, then you want to open up, especially with stories that heighten their awareness of the issue. What about if they're aware of it, but they have opposing point of view? Well, that's where, this is one of the areas that storytelling really shines. And this is where using what I call perspective shift stories are really powerful. And so I said to him, stories are really powerful. And we don't have time to go into this, but I'll share with you a resource that outlines those type of stories. So if they have the opposite point of view, so let's say back to the respect training about respectful, mindful culture. Let's say if you're working with people who think being sarcastic and busting on each other is really hilarious and makes it a fun-filled workplace. Well, they're not going to be too excited about your point of view, perhaps. And so part of your story needs to open their eyes to the possibility of a different point of view. Now, what about level of interest or motivation? So here's an example. When I do supervisory training, especially if it's a public seminar, but even if I'm working inside a company, I will open up with a story. Well, actually, let me back up for a second. I know that there are people in the seminar with varying levels of interest and motivation. I know there are people who really want to learn, and then there are other people that their boss said, go to this training, and they're not really psyched about being there. Well, part of my responsibility to the audience member and to their employer who paid for the seminar is to do my part in helping them become more interested and more motivated. And so I oftentimes will start off the supervisory training with a story that's like the tale of two supervisors, Harry and John, and sort of like Goofus and Gallant, if you ever remember those highlights cartoons. And I share a story about these two managers who worked in the same company and the different effect of their management skills. And actually, I'll make a note to post that Harry and John on the follow-up link so you can hear that story in action, because it'll give you an idea of how to start off with a story that's designed to increase motivation. So back to our examples of the different scenarios that the people emailed me in that they were dealing with. So there's a program on respect and harassment, the getting management buy-in for allowing employees to participate in wellness screening on company time. Another interesting scenario, which was really fascinating to me, was a consultant saying, how do I address the, well, you're not from this industry, what do you know issue? And actually, let me give you a quick example. So actually, let me set this context up. So in that situation, this consultants' audience oftentimes has an imposing point of view. They think only people with industry-specific knowledge can help us. And so part of this person's job is to help them see a different point of view, i.e. having somebody outside your industry is mission critical. Now, she could just say that to them, and they would just say, well, that's just, you being self-interested. That's in your self-interest to say that. Or let me give you an example. Let me stop for a second. Notice how often I say, let me give you an example. And the reason for that is I'm trying to practice what I preach. I mean, it's second nature by now. That's a way for you to make your points come alive. So even if you're thinking like, oh, I can't think in terms of stories, you can think in terms of examples. So whenever you want to make a point, just think of what I mean by that is, and then give an example, or for instance, and then give an example. So for instance, for example, there's a company called Innocentive, like innovation combined with centtive. And check out this, and I read about this in Imagine by, I think it's Jonah Lerner. I'm not sure if I'm getting the first name right. Awesome book. So Imagine. And it's all about fostering imagination, creativity, innovation, etc. And one of the examples he talks about is this company Innocentive. And here's what they do. When companies are stuck, they can't come up with a solution to a problem, they put it on Innocentive, and now it's sort of like crowdsourcing innovation. And people from all over the world and all kinds of different disciplines have the opportunity to try to solve the problem. And then they get some type of award. And what they found is oftentimes people or businesses that have spent years and thousands and sometimes millions of dollars trying to crack the code of this problem. So he gives some examples, and I wish I remembered an example because it'd make the story even more interesting. But he gives some examples in the book of, I think it was like maybe Procter & Gamble, some big, or maybe 3M, some really big innovation center company that their chemists had spent years and millions of dollars trying to solve, and somebody from like molecular biology field, they were the ones who came up with the solution. And then, so if I was this consultant, I would share that example and then talk about other examples of how people outside of industries come up with innovation because they're not restricted to the mindset and this is how it's done within the industry. So that would be an example of you knowing that they have an opposing point of view, and I'm going to tell a story that helps to challenge that in a appealing way. So step one is assessing your audience. Step two is clarifying your intent. So what's your goal here in this presentation? Again, whether it's an official presentation or a one-on-one conversation. So asking yourself, and again, you'll have these slides, is it to increase awareness and self-awareness? So oftentimes one of my goals if I'm working with leaders is for them to become more self-aware of how they come across and how they impact others. So I could just harangue them about that, or I could tell them stories about other leaders and things that they said or did that really demotivated the other person or their team because I got to hear about it from the person or the team. So is that your goal? Or maybe your goal is to challenge perspectives or limiting beliefs. It should be, well, yeah, limiting perspective or limiting beliefs. Maybe it's to increase motivation. And so you want to share stories that show both the pain of not changing and the promise, the good stuff that'll happen if they do use your information. So maybe it's offering hope that they're already painfully aware of the price that they're paying, but they don't think they can do something about it. They don't think they can change. That's where oftentimes starting off a presentation with a story that shows what happens when others use the material you're about to share with them. And then maybe your intent is to provide a path. It's not just to say, hey, good things can happen if you use this material, but you want to share a story with how it's done. So for instance, I oftentimes, when I do my Constructive Conversations program, I will share stories of difficult conversations either I've had or I've coached other people. And so not only does it provide hope, i.e. you can have these conversations and they can work out well, but also I describe almost like it's an auditory training video. I describe the process that I went through in what I said or what the other person said. So the listeners actually have sort of like a training video in their mind or virtual reality experience about how to address the situation. So that's the provide, maybe that's your goal, is to provide how-tos. And then maybe it's illustrating skills. So let's say it's a safety workshop and you don't want to bore them to death. Telling stories about people putting the skills into action and maybe saving themselves from getting a finger chopped off or chemicals splattered in their eyes or whatever it is. Okay, so let me give you a for instance. Remember, you want to say, so for instance, or here's an example. Whoops, let me back up here for a second. So I gave you an example of doing this for the respect and harassment. I actually gave you an example for supervisory training. So for those who aren't really motivated to be there, I share that story about Harry and John, those two very different supervisors. Okay, let's move on. So you've assessed your audience, you get a sense of where they are in terms of awareness, motivation, etc. You've clarified your intent. So what do I hope will happen from this presentation, this conversation? And then what are your key points?